Welcome to the webinar on Israeli-Saudi normalization, an effective incentive for Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking, ? My name is Asher Kaufman, and I'm the director of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. It has been more than 8 months after the October 7th Hamas massacre in southern Israel and the consequent Israeli assault on Gaza. And we may be facing a moment of paradigmatic shift in the Israel-Palestine conflict and the broader Middle East. Close to 40,000 Palestinian deaths, and the Gaza Strip is in a state of acute humanitarian crisis. Over 1,500 Israelis killed. Thousands are wounded and physically and emotionally. Israelis and Palestinians are in a state of trauma, anguished, filled with the sentiments of rage and revenge. And it seems that they are farther away than before October 7th from any possibility of conflict transformation. In the north, Israel and Hezbollah are on the brink of war that, if erupted, would wreak havoc in both Israel and Lebanon and potentially become a regional war, perhaps even pitting the US and Iran against each other. In this context, it seems that talking about the possibility of an Israeli-Saudi normalization might be seen removed from the reality on the ground and perhaps belonging to the old paradigm, rather than the new emerging paradigm, which we don't know yet how it would look like, but it is certainly taking shape right now as we speak. Still, it is crucial that even in this dark and very dangerous moment, we take time to also explore possible ideas about how to move constructively beyond this difficult moment and offer alternatives. The possibility of Saudi-Israeli normalization has been around since the Arab Peace Initiative from 2002 that linked the prospects of Israeli-Arab diplomatic rapprochement to the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. 18 years later, in 2000, Israel signed normalization agreements with United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco that went against the logic of the Arab Peace Initiative, since for Israel, these agreements became a means to circumvent rather than to enter Palestinian-Israeli negotiations and ignore the Palestinians altogether. Israel and Saudi Arabia were close to signing a normalization agreement before October 7th, and it is likely that this was one of the reasons behind the timing of Hamas' attack on that day. But just as with the other normalization agreements, this one was again a way for Israel to circumvent the Palestinians rather than as a vehicle to negotiate with them. As we all know now, ignoring Palestine and the Palestinians have backfired. The events since October 7th have put back the Palestinians front and center on the global stage and as critical and indispensable members for any possible political arrangement in the future. Therefore, any thought about Saudi-Israeli normalization must bring Palestinians to the table, not as an afterthought or as a byproduct, but as part of a regional arrangement whose most important short-term goal is ending the war on Gaza and preventing a war in Lebanon, and long-term, launching negotiations that would constructively transform the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We know from other peace agreements that regional and international support is necessary or even required for their success. In this context, I would like to quote Juan Manuel Santos, former president of Colombia, and the person who led Colombia into reaching the 2016 peace agreement after more than 50 years of bloody war, a war that was more deadly than the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I'm quoting him. In the interdependent world of today, no country is alone, nor can any country presume to achieve great objectives like peace unless it is accompanied in this process. Only broad international support, above all regional support, and I emphasize regional support, can facilitate and guarantee the achievement of a peace agreement and then guarantee its complex implementation. Peace processes that have ended in agreements, as in South Africa, Northern Ireland, Central America, Indonesia, Sierra Leone, and Angola, to mention just a few, had as a common denominator the positive intervention of international organizations or of countries in their respective regions, emphasis again on respective regions, helping to further the peace talks as mediators, verifiers, guarantors, or witnesses. End of quote. Indeed, research on peace agreements show that they are more likely to succeed if they are supported by regional actors and regional states. It is in this context that I believe we should think about Saudi Arabia's potential contribution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. The challenges are significant, perhaps insurmountable. Both Palestinians and Israelis suffer from an extreme crisis of leadership. Public opinion is largely against the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, and it is not clear if Saudi Arabia at all is interested in being a regional actor, the adult in the room, who would facilitate Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. Perhaps all it cares about is the relationship, a particular relationship with the United States. The United States itself is facing a political time crunch, given the upcoming presidential elections in November. To help us unpack some of these issues, we have with us a distinguished group of experts. Nimrod Goren, who is a senior fellow for Israeli Affairs at the Middle East Institute, Aziz El-Hashian, fellow of the American Gulf State Institute in Washington, Michal Yaari, a lecturer at the Hebrew University, Ben-Gurion University, and Open University, and Huda Abu Arkoub, peace-building specialist, conflict transformation expert, and the advisor to the 1325 UN Security Council resolution on women, peace, and security. Each speaker will have about 7 to 8 minutes to start us off with their preliminary ideas. We will then give the speakers an opportunity to respond to each other's comments, and we will then open it up for questions from the audience. Nimrod, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Asher. I would like to take my first minutes to present some sort of analytical framework on the use of incentives in conflict resolution in the Israeli-Arab case, and then spell out a bit the developments or normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia that happened or began like a decade ago, and where are things now in terms of the linkage or the question of the linkage between Israeli-Saudi normalization and Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. On incentives and peacemaking. So we are talking about whether an incentive of better relations for Israel with Saudi Arabia can alter position policies towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the underlying assumption is that incentives are an effective tool for peacemaking. But when you look at the history of peace-building efforts, we see the international intervention or attempts to impact or influence countries in conflict is more often linked to sanctions than to incentives. And if incentives are on the table, it's most likely to be like sweeteners. Sweeteners is something that is promised to a side to a conflict once it's already reached the time in which it signs an agreement, rather than something that is promised upfront in advance to help shape the narrative, the debate within the public, to legitimize a process of peace and to see additional benefits on why such a peace agreement is valuable. When we look at the recent, let's say, 2 decades in Israeli-Arab relationship, we see 3 incentives that were put on the table, but none of them were actually effective enough. Asher, you already mentioned the Arab Peace Initiative, which basically spelled out to Israel normalization or normal relations with the entire Arab world, also endorsed by the Muslim countries organization. So something that Israel has been yearning for since its establishment of regional acceptance in return for an end of conflict. We had an incentive coming from the European Union offering Israel and the Palestinian state that we eventually established a special privileged partnership with the EU. And we had an American security incentive devised by John Allen under the Obama administration, talking about a security plan for a 2-state solution. Each incentive tried to address a different need of Israel, of the Palestinians, but they failed. They failed because they did not address the 4 parameters that an effective incentive for peace should address. And those are, first, the attractiveness of the incentive, whether the thing that is being offered to a side to the conflict is considered by the people themselves as something important enough, attractive enough. Sometimes the third party, the international actor offering the incentive, does not know to identify correctly what is the real need of the people on the ground. So attractiveness is one. The second is the feasibility. How much is the promise that is being given actually seen as feasible? Do, for example, the Israelis trust the Arab League when they introduced the Arab Peace Initiative at the time? Is there a sense that this is a promise that it could actually be fulfilled? The third is about public awareness. Does the public actually know that an incentive was presented? And in most of the incentives that I mentioned, most Israelis did not even hear about in real time. And fourth is the issue of linkage to conflict resolution. Is an incentive understood as something that a country could only be getting once it resolves the conflict? Or like in the case of Israel-US security relations, the sense of Israel is that Israel eventually could get the same thing, the same security guarantees with the US, with or without an actual peace agreement being signed. So each of those three incentives that were put on the table before actually failed on at least two of the four parameters, and we can elaborate on that later on. So now, after that failure, when we come to think of future incentives, we need to find a way in which those parameters are addressed and in which the different incentives, the different international and regional actors can put on the table are well coordinated, are not presented each one at different time without any sense to it. And that coordination is something that we saw recently with the Saudis taking the lead together with the EU and others on a package, a support package for peace. It was framed initially as a peace day effort, something the EU was leading, putting Israel-Saudi normalization within a context of an incentive package for peace. But when we look at what's happening between Israel and Saudi Arabia, we see that actually already a decade ago, things began to change. And there is a gradual opening of Saudi Arabia towards Israel, a de facto one, which kind of resembles what happened with United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. It signifies a strategic direction by the Saudi leadership to open up towards eventual normalization, to do a gradual process, step by step, beginning with softer issues of media engagement, of culture, of religion, maybe sports, maybe utilizing multilateral events, organization to try and spark some sort of engagement, exchange that is becoming more regular, more normalized in the eyes of societies, making the eventual normalization less dramatic. And with that taking place over a period of 10 years, the sense is that Israel and Saudi Arabia are quite ready for the breakout of normalization. And that was the situation prior to October 7th. For a breakout, you need to have some sort of relationship to the Palestinian issue. And that changed. Now the context is different. The price that was presented in the past in the Arab Peace Initiative, a clear linkage between first the Palestinian state, then normalization. I think that has changed. We saw the change happening before October 7, and maybe it's even existent today. So the linkage, the factor of impact of an incentive, the linkage between conflict resolution and the delivery of the incentive, there is a question mark, there is some ambiguity in the eyes of Israelis when they think of normalization with the Saudis. What is the Saudi price for normalization? What should Israel do? In the past, it was obvious, establish a Palestinian state. Now, it's a bit more ambiguous. Is it pathways to a Palestinian state? Is it irreversible moves? Is it about recognition? Is it about commitments? The way we think is perhaps if Netanyahu would have done today his Bar Ilan speech from 15 years ago, in which he spoke something about the Palestinian state being established, whether that could eventually now be enough for the Saudis to normalize. And with those question marks appearing in Israel and with an outlook towards the future, 2030, Saudi Arabia hosting the Expo exhibition, like the UAE did several years ago, a very big encore for opening up to Israel because the one hosting such an event should also enable Israelis to participate. So if we are thinking 5 to 10 years ahead, it seems like the strategy or the vision of the Saudi leadership does see the normalization eventually taking place. How do we do that and ensure that this includes a clear component of Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking? I think that's the challenge or the responsibility of those of us who care on linking Israel-Arab relations with Israeli-Palestinian peace.
Thank you very much, Nimrod, for your thoughts and for sticking with our time. And the floor is yours, Aziz, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Asher. And it's great to join you all sharing this very fantastic panel. There's a lot of great things that I think you mentioned, Asher, in your introduction. And so I'd like to use it as a segue into some of the things that I want to say now. And I think, you know, one of the things that you mentioned in particular was this, the paradigm, you know, that we were, I think, now reaching or going out of a new paradigm. In my opinion, I think one of the things that I would say is that not only is there a new paradigm, but I think we are now in a new Arab-Israeli order. In my estimation, I don't think October 7th per se ushered in a new order, but I think the discussions of the day after I think the how we resolve the issues afterwards, who will take responsibility. You know, you mentioned, for example, that, well, is Saudi Arabia going to be the adult in the room and going to organize and coordinate these issues? These are all questions that I think really necessitated that we have now reached the limit of a previous order. We're coming out of a previous order where I think pragmatism, tacitness, hesitancy, reluctancy, and a different kind of Arab positioning around the Palestinian issue, the Palestinian Arab-Israeli issue, was, I think, the key themes. And now, I think when it comes to, for example, current issues, current necessities, we need to be more, I think, explicit. And let me just reiterate what I just said. I think traditionally, Saudi policy towards Israel has been historically pragmatic. When it comes to, for example, you mentioned the Arab Peace Initiative. Saudi Arabia has actually offered normalization to Israel before the Arab Peace Initiative, during the mid-90s, when it was making tracks on if it would make progress on the Israeli-Syrian track in the mid-90s. So they were ready to normalize relations then. Of course, there is the Fahd plan and the Fez plan of the early 80s, 1981 and 1982 respectively. So normalization was always there. But the thing is that the Saudis always said was that we are ready to normalize relations, we are ready to make peace with Israel if there is a Palestinian state, a Palestinian solution, a just solution. And what's very fascinating about this is that I think historically, especially before the Arab Spring, many people viewed the Saudi position as very kind of fixated on Palestinian statehood. The reality is, I think after the Arab Spring, then began the questioning of whether or not, hey, will Saudi Arabia normalize relations with Israel in the face of this growing Iranian threat? And that's when many people started to, in my opinion, look at Saudi pragmatism and kind of disframe what the Saudis say towards Israel and try to construct a different kind of image that the Saudis are willing to move away from the Palestinians, from its Arab position, in favor of normalizing relations with Israel. And I think even leading up to, for example, 2020, this is what many people assumed would happen, that the Saudis would just move away from the Arab Peace Initiative and embrace Israel. And I think the current discussions now illustrate the fact that there has to be a Palestinian element. Now, the question is, what is this element? The Saudi discourse towards Israel has always, and vis-a-vis, I think, the Palestinian issue, has always been, as I said, pragmatic, but also not very fixed. It's always been, you know, as Nimrod said, a bit vague, a bit based on constructive ambiguity. And the reason being is that I think because our position was that we've always been consistent. You always hear a lot of Saudis say this. We've been very consistent throughout history. And the reason what makes us very consistent is because we always speak with a discourse of principles, not in the discourse of details. And that's what enables our discourse to be kind of based on principles. Now, what is this principle? Is it a Palestinian issue? Is it a Palestinian state? For me, I think what is required, what is the core issue that Saudi wants, or the key element that will allow or usher in a Saudi-Israeli normalization, of course, notwithstanding the American aspect, is some Israeli concessions. What are these concessions? In particular, it's not really what Israelis are going to say. It's more importantly what the Palestinians won't say, what the PA won't say, which is that this is a very bad deal for us, that this is, you know, an illegitimate deal. This is not, you know, this is not something we support. And this is, for me, I think that the absolute bare minimum of what the Saudis and the Palestinians, and also the, you know, this is where the positionality, I would say, is that, so it's a part of a negotiation between Saudi Arabia and the Palestinians. nor I would say the PA. That has its own issues, has its own also, representative legitimacy issues and et cetera. And so I think this aspect makes it very unclear what it is that will enable normalization to take place. It is deliberately ambiguated, I would say. It is deliberately made to be ambiguous and therefore to allow the situation to take place. To allow the context to render it either feasible or not feasible. After the war, there are a few things that changed, in my opinion, regarding the Saudi perception towards the Palestinian-Israeli question. I think very traditionally, the Saudis have said, the region can no longer move on unless there is a Palestinian-Israeli solution. In my opinion, this was a theoretical concern, that the Saudis had a regional concern, that this was that something had to be solved, because I think this issue would be, okay, this issue, I still have time, do I, Asher? Thank you. So this issue.
1 more minute.
Oh my goodness gracious. Okay. So this issue cannot move on. The region cannot move on unless there is a Palestinian-Israeli solution. In my estimation, this was a theoretical concern. This was a concern that probably the region, many people in the region perceived it as, yes, okay, we have to address this issue. There was it wasn't, I don't think it was believed regionally that, there was something that could have been explosive on the horizon. Some people saw it, but not to this level. And I think after the war, it made, I think, actors in the region, especially Saudi Arabia, to realize that, okay, this threat of regional instability is real. It's a real war. I mean, it's a real concern. And anybody that's following Saudi Arabia now realizes that regional stability is key for it to reach its lofty goals of Vision 2030. Vision 2030 cannot be achieved in a unstable region. And so there are a few things that I wanted to mention, but I wanted to kind of lay out the Saudi kind of position. And just one more, just a few words on this. I think what needs to happen, there was always the discussion before, is this out-in approach, the out-in Saudi normalization, that if you could normalize relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, you could then kind of begin to develop relations between or help the Palestinian issue. In my opinion, I think we need to borrow this phrase of out-in, but give it new meaning. I think we should have an out-in approach when it comes to Saudi Arabia, the region, the United States, Europe, and then work together on trying to coordinate what is needed for the Palestinian-Israeli situation. Because as you guys mentioned rightly, the situation in Palestine and in Israel domestically is just incredibly, it's not ripe for any kind of peace discussion. That is precisely why I think the actors on the periphery need to be working a lot more and not have a hot potato effect. Because I think once the war happened, there was a hot potato effect. There was the Saudis, you take responsibility. And then it was the United States, you take responsibility. And the last point is that I would say is that Saudi Arabia, there's a lot of pressure on Saudi and a lot of pressure on the Saudi-Israeli normalization to usher in peace. And I don't think that's fair, because in my estimation, what is necessary is not a Saudi-Israeli normalization, but it's to changing the framework of negotiations. And basically, Saudi Arabia historically has said, listen, we don't have any leverage over Israel. It's the United States that has to have, that could pressure Israel. And then, that could then change something on the ground. To ask Saudi Arabia to hinder its interest with the United States, and to take matters into its own hands, this is a big issue that requires not just Saudi Arabia, not just the United States, not just Europe. It requires a regional and international push simultaneously, harmoniously. And I'll stop at there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Aziz. Michal, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Asher. When I was a kid in the 80s, there was a very famous song called I Was Born to Peace. The song was written in 1979 during the final stages of the negotiation between Israel and its biggest enemy at the time, Egypt. The song talked about the dream that one day peace would come. For many Israelis, peace was seen not just as a way to end wars, but as an idea, something that you wished for every night before you're going to sleep. And it might come true one day. Since then, 40 years have passed with bloody wars between Israel and its neighbors. In 2018, I wrote academic articles about the possibility of formal relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. My conclusion was very clear. Although the two countries share the same interests, especially in security, Saudi Arabia would not sign a peace agreement with Israel without a major breakthrough in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In September 2023, Mohammed bin Salman made me realize how wrong I was. In his remarkable interview with Fox News, he made it very clear that Saudi Arabia would not demand a heavy price from Israel regarding the Palestinian issue as a condition for peace agreement. Wow, we were so close to a new Middle East just a few months ago. But was it good for Israel's interests? Is peace in return for peace indeed the best formula for Israel? The answer seems obvious. There are great benefits for peace with Saudi Arabia. First, not only would Saudi Arabia, the most important and influential country in the Arab Muslim world, sign a peace agreement with us, but it would also open the door for improved and warmer relations with other Arab countries and even Muslim countries like Indonesia, the biggest Muslim country in the world. Second, it would bring prosperity to the Israeli economy due to cooperation with the strongest economy in the Middle East and other economies around the world. For example, think about the change a regional train would bring to the Middle East. Third, peace with Saudi Arabia would contribute to the Israel's image, not only in the West world, but also in the Arab world. Israel would not be perceived as the bad guy of the neighborhood, but quite the opposite, a legitimate and important partner for securing and improving the lives of millions. Fourth, security cooperation would help Israel's ability to defend itself from its enemies. Fifth, official relations with Saudi Arabia would allow Saudi Arabia to use its unique mediation skills at a time of crisis between Israel and its neighbors. Sixth, it would bring civil cooperation in science, culture, sport, art, etc. And last, it would create regional cooperation in dealing with the climate crisis. And the list goes on and on. Only 8 months ago, it seems that there was no need to imagine anymore. This is what John Lennon meant. While I was occupied with what were on my trip to Saudi Arabia, I hoped that the Palestinian leadership would get the message that everyone had enough of its dogmatic attitude and not sabotage this unbelievable moment. But then came the October 7th, and the Palestinian state once again became the irreconcilable condition for formal relation with Israel. Nowadays, Saudi Arabia could not be clearer with its demand from Israel. If you want peace, come to the negotiating table with a strategic plan for solving the Palestinian issue, and this time without using military means. Needless to say, for parts of the Israeli public, talks about Palestinian state during the war in Gaza are unbearable. Yes, they want to see Saudi airplane land at Ben Gurion Airport and MBS speaking in the Israeli parliament, but only if it comes with no concessions to the Palestinians. The problem with peace with Arab states is that it's not just a paper that different sides should sign. It demands us, the Israeli people, to ask ourselves what kind of states we want to live in. If we avoid defining the values on which the state of Israel is founded, if we avoid asking ourselves what kind of states we want to be, a state that seeks to peace or a state that just only talk about peace, we will continue to find ourselves in a bloody cycle of military conflicts with no solution on the horizon, just more dead people. If we cannot agree on the identity and moral basics of Israel, how can anyone define the benefits and the price of peace, let alone agree on it? I can talk for hours about the benefits of peace with Saudi Arabia, but as long as the Israeli society is led by radicals, fanatics, and extremists, there is no point in discussing peace. How can I approach people from Kuwait, Jordan, or the UAE and start a conversation with them while a Knesset member from the coalition is calling for bombing Gaza with a nuclear weapon? Let me say it very loud and clear. It would be a terrible mistake for all parties to support a peace agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia if the current government in Israel is still in power. Peace can only flourish and on fruitful ground at the right time, and now is not the right time. Israel and Saudi Arabia should continue cooperating on core issues like security, but only behind closed doors. Until there is a major change in the Israeli and the Palestinian leadership, peace will continue to be a nice word from a song that I loved when I was a kid. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michal. I also grew up on that song, as was Nimrod, I'm sure. Huda, please, the floor is yours.
شكرا كتير Asher, thank you so much, and for the organizers also. I want to start first by acknowledging the fact that right now, while we are talking, there are people who are losing their lives to this conflict and still losing their lives and will continue to lose their lives until someone comes to the table and says it's enough. And I think the only regional actor now that have that capacity to use leverage is the Saudis. Saudi Arabia is very important, and I agree with you, Aziz. We should not practice more pressure on Saudi, and we should not use the hot potato theory. I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that the Saudis are presenting now themselves as the only sane actors in the group, in the region, and the ones who actually has a strategy. And I think the Palestinians are missing this at this point, because we are very busy with the day-to-day or minute-to-minute crises we're dealing with. But I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that it's not only the Palestinians who are knocking at the Saudi doors. And we need to speak about why Netanyahu is interested in a Saudi deal before and even now after the war. And from there, we need to define why the Palestinians would be against any normalization deal now in these circumstances, because it will be seen as, a crowning for the king of Israel at this point, which is Netanyahu. Thanks to the spoilers in the region, or the proxies in the region, we've always, as policy people, find ourselves reshifting our thinking and replanning and reanalyzing the situation. I think it's important here to say that any deal in the region without the Palestinians being part of it is going to fail. I mean, this is the biggest lesson that we've learned. Anyone with few very, let's say, not technologically advanced weapons can bring the temple down. So let's talk about why we need to speak to the Saudis as Palestinians now. And we need to tell the Saudis that it's important to acknowledge all the actors in the Palestinian scene. And from here, I want to introduce the second point, which is it's important for us to acknowledge that Hamas is not going away. And this war has, after 8-9 months, 50,000 people losing their lives. It's proving that Hamas is not going away. If Israel couldn't finish Hamas in the first week of the war, then there is here a huge issue when it comes to the military capacity of one of the almighty military based countries in the region. So inclusivity is important, and I saw that when I talked with Saudis that we cannot fragment the solution. We cannot give a piece of the cake to the Israelis and not give a piece to other actors in the region, including the Palestinians. So I would call on the Israelis in general to start thinking of ways in order to include the Palestinian voices as much as the Saudis did. And I have to acknowledge the fact that was very wise move on the Saudi side to talk to the Palestinians, ask them what you want. And there was one answer, the Arab Initiative, you know. And I have to, again, another acknowledgement, the Palestinians have missed more opportunities than ever in their history, in their struggle because of the leadership. I agree with you, Michal. We need to change the leadership in the world. Maybe we need to bring more women. And I acknowledge also the fact that there were many strong Saudi women who I talked to and were very spot on when it came to policy. So aside from the fact that we need to change leadership in the world, which in my opinion is a minority that is leading now with a minority behind them, unfortunately, it's fanatic minority in the world, but everything is changing. This situation is reminding me of the Second World War, the post-Second World War. And I think it's important now to start looking for other people who can practice leverage and accountability. Saudi Arabia is one of them, and that's why it's very important to keep Saudi Arabia in default. Saudi Arabia was very successful in also managing the other spoilers or state actors in the region, like Iran. If you guys remember the visits, exchange visits between Iranians and Saudis. If you remember the Arab League meeting in Saudi Arabia when Zelensky was sitting with Bashar al-Assad. So in my opinion, this was where the leverage of the Saudi Arabia and the power of the Saudi Arabia in the region manifested itself. Any deal now that would give a prize to the Israelis would be rejected by the Palestinians, not only by the Palestinians, but all people around the world. So I think it's wise now to start talking about a deal that is more inclusive, that speaks to the urgent needs, which is a humanitarian urgent need. I think every one of us who wants to speak about any kind of policy, we need to start with time to stop the war now, ceasefire now. And I think this is where the Saudis can bring their game into the region by practicing that leverage on all actors, including Hamas, which I know for sure that they have a soft spot for Saudis at this point, because they are also in a difficult position and they need someone to help. I think what I would ask everyone in the world is to keep pushing for a policy, a recommendation that comes with a mechanism of implementation to stop the war immediately. Talk about the day after, which is Saudi Arabia. One of the reasons why people are knocking at the door of Saudi Arabia is the reconstruction and rebuilding of Gaza. But also try and teach the Israelis a lesson about how God can come to the picture. I think for the Israelis, they should know that God is not going to come forward this time, and that this Armageddon mentality is not working. I don't think God, when he or she decides to do Armageddon, will take 8 months to do it. So I think there is a lot of teaching that needs to happen on the Israeli side. There is a lot of healing needs to happen on the Israeli side, same as on the Palestinian side. And I'm looking for someone who can bring some sort of sanity to the region. And my answer is Saudi Arabia now. The big question is, how can we be of help to the Saudis if they want to embark in such a risky matter? Because everyone is losing when it comes to Palestine and Israel. The United States is losing. They might be, the Saudis are better with a Trump in the administration rather than Biden. No stakes are going to be on the table. The Saudis can get what they want from the Americans without a deal with the Israelis if Trump is in power. But again, I want to emphasize that Aziz's point about stability is not just a need, it's actually a policy. And if we don't have stability in the region, then nothing will work. And if we don't resolve the Palestinian issue, then we will not have stability in the region. That simple. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Huda, for your words, for your insights. I would like to give the panelists an opportunity to respond to each other's comments, and we can do it in the order of the speakers. So Nimrod, take a few minutes and share with us your reflections. Go ahead.
Thank you. I would make 5 points. First, the issue of stability. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, the similarity in framing of what happened between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain and what happened with the Saudis. We see it again with the emphasis on stability. When we as Israelis began to engage with the Emiratis after the Abraham Accords, we heard time and time again that yes, there is a bilateral component to this relationship, but from an Emirati point of view, it's a much bigger frame of regional stability, of a new era, of a new region, and I think the Saudi language goes along the same lines. The second point is about what needs to be prevented, because that same line that we heard about the stability, the Emirati and Bahraini model, basically set up regional mechanisms that were important, but did not include the Palestinian component that was mentioned by some of the speakers, whether it's the Negev Forum, bringing together the normalization countries together with Egypt, whether it's the Prosperity Project in which Jordan and the UAE and Israel exchange electricity or water or planned to exchange, the MOUs on energy with the EU on water dialogue with Egypt and Morocco. These did not include the Palestinian component, and if and when the Saudis enter the normalization picture, I think they should also reflect from day one that the regional stability they are seeking for does include very clearly a Palestinian component. So that's the second. The third is about how the war changed or impacted perceptions in Israel about normalization with the Saudis, because what we saw when Israel was attacked by Iran, we saw the Saudis playing a role in defending it. And when the Houthis are blocking the shipment through the Red Sea, we saw the Saudis somehow involved in all kind of solution to bypass that through a land bridge. So from an Israeli perspective, it goes both ways. One way is, look how much potential is out there. If that sort of cooperation on our key national interest is possible at the time of war, imagine what would have happened if an Israeli government was willing to advance towards peace. So that's one narrative. The other narrative that goes in contrast is, no, we already get what we need. Okay, so all this normalization language is nice, but for those opposed the two-state solution, and unfortunately in Israel we have quite many of those, they say we are getting from the Saudis already our key needs already, so why bother about moving on the Palestinian issue? That relates to the 4 points, which is about public support. Public support in Israel, normalization with the Saudis is very high. It's not a contentious political issue. Polls conducted before the war and after war see support in that. Recent polls that also relate or link the Saudi normalization issue to the Biden plan for hostage release, ceasefire, diffusion of tensions with Lebanon, with Hezbollah on the Lebanon border, that has broad support. So there's a plurality or a majority within the Israeli public for a package that includes normalization with the Saudis and leads to an end of war in Gaza. These things are linked through American diplomacy, not necessarily effectively until now, but they gain support within the Israeli public. The Israeli public is willing to make concessions on its position with the Palestinian issue for the sake of normalization with the Saudis and broader regional benefits. And then we go to the multilateral aspect. And, it was mentioned about the Saudi role in mediation, but we don't see that yet. If we look at the countries that are currently engaged in mediation and trying to find solutions, especially on Gaza, we see the Americans, we see the Egyptians, we see the Qataris, maybe some European countries are looking for a way in, but Saudi Arabia decided, I think, not to go there at the moment. It does its own negotiation with the Americans, but if and when it decides to go into the multilateral framing, I think it has lots to offer. We saw the Saudis convening on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly 2 years ago, a multilateral conference on the Arab Peace Initiative. We saw it being part of last year's sideline events at the UN on its incentives for peace. September is coming up. The UNGA will convene again. I think this is a time in line of this peace conference idea that was suggested by the Arab Vision paper that is discussed by the EU for the Saudis to try and play a role there as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Nimrod. Aziz, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Asher, and thank you to all the speakers. I just want to combine something that Nimrod and Huda said, which is something about the multilaterals and kind of providing a condition for which Saudis can participate a bit more in. And I think Huda's point is spot on when it comes to helping the Saudis. For me, I think helping the Saudis help the situation. This is the question that we have to start asking ourselves: is how can we enable, in other words, conditions that allow Saudi Arabia to use its leverage to facilitate and to help bring about a Palestinian-Israeli settlement, or at least momentum towards it. And I think the first issue here is the notion of sequence. How, if we start playing the Saudi card, if we were to use those metaphors now, I think we've used an opportunity when the situation and the conditions are very, very, very unripe. And therefore, the last bit of leverage is then gone towards the situation. Therefore, I think what is best is to help create the conditions first of all, and then allow a use of the Saudi normalization card against the backdrop of conditions that enable it to bring about all these issues. Now, another point. I'm sorry, there's just a lot of points here that are going and running around in my head. The second issue, there's another thing. Saudi was very proactive. There's a lot of criticism on Saudi Arabia, and that Saudi Arabia is not doing much, quote unquote. It's siding with Israel, etc. Why? Because it's not using oil as a weapon. These are all very ignorant, very superficial, statements, in my opinion. If one was to look at what Saudi did after Gaza, after the Gaza war, or after October 7th, it was very, very politically, diplomatically proactive. It traveled around to a lot of international capitals. It hosted the Riyadh summit, the Islamic and Arab summit. Now, why did it do that? It did that because it believed that its efforts would be tangible, that the goals were tangible. So if basically, the fact that if it's exerting effort, if it's making sure it's going around to travel and bringing about a current situation, it will do it. It will invest effort. Now, with the current Palestinian-Israeli American-dominated situation, the Saudi ruling elite and others around the world believe that, okay, what kind of political effort can I do here? Whichever effort I will exert, it's not going to do anything on the ground because it's an American-dominated situation. It's American-dominated framework. And therefore, our efforts is really dependent on what happens between this dynamic of Palestinian, Israeli, American dynamic. And therefore, it just makes people say, well, we can't really exert any effort here, because otherwise it won't bring any fruit. Therefore, if what we can do in kind of rethinking the approach of the Palestinian-Israeli structure of negotiations, I would say, and make it more tangible that, listen, if Saudi Arabia, if there is progress on 1, 2, and 3, if there is progress on A, B, and C, this will then enable an official approachment, kind of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Now, that's the thing that I would say. The last point that I would say is what Nimrod mentioned just recently as a Palestinian component. I think what should happen for the Saudi-Israeli card, what kind of Palestinian component should there be, is two. There's a Palestinian component should be divided into two. First one is a consolatory, a component of consolidation. In other words, to really get kind of a Palestinian element to make sure that it is irreversible. And that is something that you can see in what the Saudi statements are saying. They're all saying we're looking for irreversible steps. We're looking for credible irreversible steps. Now, whether that is area C to area B, whether that is a seizement of settlements, that, we should be focusing on something that is very irreversible. The second element, which I don't think has received a lot of attention on, is a facilitatory element. So what happens after Saudi-Israeli normalization happens? And at this point, if Saudi-Israeli normalization happens, but we're talking about the future here, and that should be a living Palestinian component. And in my opinion is that as Saudi-Israeli relations develop and continue, then there has to be a Palestinian element in it. And I think with that, it enables a few things. It enables, of course, addressing the core issue, but also for Saudi Arabia, and it helps legitimize the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And so that's why there has to be a facilitatory element. It's continuing. That's all I'll say now.
Thank you, Aziz. Michal, please.
Yes, I would like to ask Aziz, in what situation do you think that the Saudi Arabia leadership would say to the Israeli leadership and the Palestinian leadership, you crossed the red line, that's it, I had enough of you? Do you see any kind of situation? Maybe they will wait until the government of Israel will be replaced, or the Palestinian leadership would be replaced in order to achieve peace between Saudi Arabia and Israel?
Just very quick question to answer that quickly. They could say that all they want. Everybody could say that all they want. Everyone knows that we could say that no matter how many times. It's up to the United States to really put the real red line there. And that's why they're not going to bother saying red lines, red lines, red lines, because they know it's the United States that is the only actor that could enforce a red line.
Thank you.
I actually responded in my comments because I was left to last, which is great. So I had time to think about it. But I think I have a question about how we can help each other all in order to put forward some tangible, pragmatic policy recommendations for the Saudis now that brings everyone's voice into the fold without taking away from the fact that the United States is still the major player in the room, and that the Saudis, with their subtle, pragmatic diplomacy, managed to gain some really good wins for the Palestinians. The three countries who acknowledged Palestine as a state, that was part of what the Saudis did behind the scenes. But how can we do that as a collective in order to make sure that there is enough leverage used again used with the Israelis and the Palestinians at the same time? Because one of the issues that we're facing is that the Israelis are not all agreeing on one thing they want from the Saudis, and also the Palestinians not at this time, they are not in a good place where they can make these recommendations. So this is something that I would encourage everyone to think of, and maybe ask the Saudis to help with by inviting people who can help with that, by creating working groups, although I know that they've done that, but something that can actually address the situation now and create the context that Aziz was speaking about, the context where the Saudis can actually bring a deal to the table. Without that context, nothing can happen. So there is a sense of urgency here, and I think it's important for all of us to acknowledge it and work towards making it happen. Did we lose the Asher?
Yeah, we lost our moderator due to connectivity, but I guess he will, or at least will try to join us back. So I'll relate to that, and then I could pick up some of the questions that we have from the audience and let you reply. And I think the practical steps that you ask about, I think it's an important issue. I think it's very valuable that such discussions that are involving Israelis, Palestinians, and Saudis are taking place. I know that there was another conference by Chatham House that did the same recently. And I think that's an important messaging because it reflects and puts into practice this Palestinian component and inclusivity that we want to see in the official relations. So I think this is a valuable issue. Plus, when I look at the Israeli political map and you see the polls in Israel, you see how many Israelis want to have early elections coming. And the Saudi issue could become a factor in the Israeli debate. Because if eventually the US-Saudi negotiations, whatever deal or agreement they will reach bilaterally, will put on the table a very clear agenda for the Israeli people to reflect on when they go to vote next time, on an opportunity for normalization with the Saudis and the change of Israeli policy that it demands, that could have an impact on the domestic debate. So putting the normalization on the table, not implementing it, but clarifying what needs to be done in the hope of, by that, catalyzing leadership change in Israel. And Asher, good to have you back. We're handing it over back to you.
Yes, I'm sorry. I want to follow up with a couple of questions that came up in our chat. One focuses on the US in this equation because clearly Saudi Arabia has prime interests in this possibility through the benefits it would get from the United States. And one of the questions that we received is that we have not really addressed this issue. And could you make a few comments about that point? The other question that was raised that I think is important is that at least for some of us, there was a lot of focus on Saudi Arabia and regional players and not enough focus perhaps on Israel-Palestine. And there is always this tension between what should you prioritize, the regional support or the local actors. And I have my own thoughts about both issues, but I will let you take the lead on those and give you the opportunity to answer these two questions.
Yeah, if I can, Asher, just quickly touch on the Saudi American kind of element. Sure. I think what the Abraham Accords has done is that it really changed the notion of burden of concession. It shifted the burden of concessions from Israelis to the Palestinians to the United States. And as a result, normalization with Israel now has become an opportunity. And therefore, this is what has happened with the Abraham Accords. So in some ways, it facilitated cooperation with the Gulf between Israel and Gulf countries. But at the same time, you could say it complicated the road because now for Saudi Arabia, it complicated the road between Israel and Saudi Arabia, I would say, because now for Saudi Arabia, is that saying, listen, you know, it senses the leverage that it has due to the immense amount of political desperation of Saudi-Israeli normalization in both Tel Aviv and in DC. So many people now in DC want to see it happen. And as a result, the Saudis responded by saying, listen, this is the price that you have to pay now to address this issue. And therefore, this is what complicated the road. Now, what tells you that for Saudi Arabia to normalize relations with Israel, there has to be a Palestinian element, is that notwithstanding the American package, they're still calling for something on the Palestinian issue. So, you know, we can no longer just keep saying, forget about it. The Saudis are really just don't want to have a Palestinian issue. You know, they're just going to move on. You know, no. And again, this is just an opportunity for us to do something which is stop kicking the can down the road, the Palestinian-Israeli peace can down the road. I think the Saudi normalization is an opportunity to stop that, to finally address these issues head on and, you know, create a new Middle East, hopefully.
If I can go after Aziz, I think it's time for us to start thinking holistically as a region. And that's why I brought up the Second World War. I think it's important for new actors to play a major role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and not only make the Israeli-Palestinian conflict the only aspect of stability in the region. It is a condition for stability, but I think it's important for us to create a regional, holistic approach to solving and resolving or transforming conflicts within the region. We should not forget about Yemen. We should not forget about Sudan. We should not forget about other conflicts in the region. And I think I heard that more than once. Again, I lose Asher when I speak. This is actually part of what the Saudis communicated to us more than once in closed rooms, that it's not just about Israel and Palestine. It should not continue to be only about Israel and Palestine. We've learned the lesson that Israel and Palestine is a priority and it should be resolved because it can bring the element of stability of the region to a level of no return. But there are other issues within the region that needs to be addressed. And so I think in the future, we need a strong regional actor that can lead, that can somehow create a balance when it comes to the brokers of conflicts in the world. And we've been calling for that for a long time because the Americans cannot do that anymore. I'm sorry to say that, but we've known their biased approach led us to what we are witnessing now from their failure even to practice their leverage again with the Israeli government. So I think it's important for us to start looking at the region as a holistic package and start looking at policy as packaging rather than just one central issue. I know the Israelis want to always feel that they are the most important people in the region, but they are not. And the Palestinians, they are not. There are other people who are important to the stability of the region, but we need to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict first.
If I may add to that, I think there are two dimensions. One is the minilateral cooperation within the Middle East and even inter-regional or interregional connectivity or mechanism that address broader regional problems or issues or opportunities, and in which Israel, before the war, found it's much more easy to be part of than before. In the past, Israel was hesitant into going into multilateral mechanism because it was afraid those will be used to push it on the Palestinian issue, which it didn't want. Recently, that has changed for the better. So the idea of tackling broader regional issues together, I think, is more compelling in Israel than it used to be. But then when you look at multilateralism and the conflict resolution issue on the Israeli-Palestinian, you see that there is no multilateral mechanism now dealing specifically with this topic. No, we remember the quartet, the Middle East Quartet is still in existence, but when did it do something? When did it convene? It's not functioning for years. And most of those countries that want to see Middle East peace do not step up their diplomatic efforts in order to set up an alternative mechanism that could drive the things forward. And I think that requires, of course, American leadership, but it requires a new, updated composition of such a mechanism. It's no longer the EU, the UN, Russia, and the US. You need to have the regional countries part of whatever mechanism is set up, and that should be a goal, I think, for maybe the next administration, when it wants to set up a different context for peacemaking, set up this regional international mechanism that can help the process move forward.
Thank you, Nimrod. Michal, would you like to? You're good. So I want to give you the opportunity, perhaps in the conclusion, to go back to my first point about where we are right now and the whole idea of, are we in this position of a paradigm shift in the region, perhaps globally? I mean, this conflict that began Israel versus Hamas, Israel versus Palestinians, clearly has become a regional issue. It has global implications with Iran, Russia, China, Ukraine, US elections. There are so many extensions that you could think of in relations to the crisis that we are facing now. So perhaps if you can just go around the screen and share with us your thoughts, no more than 1 minute, of where we are and where do you think we might be going in the next, really in the short term? Nimrod, would you like to start?
Yes, of course, we're in a difficult situation, and the risk of escalation is very much there, and we see what's brewing on Israel-Lebanon border, so things could even get worse. And I think at this time, it's very important to maintain and open the channels of dialogue within the region. And while many people are disengaging or going into advocacy for one side or the other, to enable people from the different countries who still aspire for peace to have a space in which they not only talk to each other, but also talk to the public and convey the message and urgency of moving towards peace. Doing that in a broad regional setting, sticking, I think, to the old paradigm of a two-state solution, which I think is still the most relevant and feasible solution to this conflict, looking at it from a regional perspective and talking about the future, talking about peace, talking about opportunities, looking for the silver linings. I think it's very easy to go to the negativities, but we also need to inject some positive policy outlook into the debate.
I would go next. Aziz, do you want to go first? So I think, from a human perspective, we are in a very deep, I would think in our current history, this is one of the worst humanitarian tragedies that we are witnessing, at least in the past 10 years. And I cannot go on thinking of policy without thinking that the urgency is to save lives. And we need to make sure that this is the only ask on the table now. I also think that, yes, there will be a paradigm shift in the region. I am seeing the Saudis leading that effort in the region. And if it's driven by the interest of stability, I think it's going to work. I am very optimistic again because I want to save lives. At the end of the day, this is the goal that we all should be striving for. And at some point, one of the hopes that I see is that there is this whole argument about Palestine taking place all over the world, and the polarization is becoming even more and more clear, but there is a sweeping support for saving lives, and I think this is really important to focus on. And in our thinking of the region, we need to find mechanisms to stop any opportunity for such an atrocity to happen, for such a war to happen again. And if we sign all kinds of agreements and deals without having a mechanism that has the capacity to implement decisions made on high level on the ground to stop any kind of genocide happening in the region or in the world, then it doesn't speak, it doesn't have power. And that's where I find the hope that the human tragedy in Gaza is going to make us all aware of the fact that we are all vulnerable when it comes to this region. One crazy maniac can lead a war that will kill us all, and we need to stop that.
Michal, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Let me be optimistic. I think that our greatest goal nowadays is to promote peace between people to people peace, warm peace. And regarding the Israeli people, we should start learn about our neighbors. We should start reading the newspaper, the Arab newspaper. We should be aware of the core issues of the Saudi society, of the Jordan society, of the Lebanon society. We should be much more focused on the civilian aspect and not just give the floor to our leaders, because as we talked before, don't have at the current moment the best leadership that we ever dreamt of. So maybe we should start talking between ourselves, and that's the way to bring peace to the Middle East.
Thank you. I mean, I can't help but agree with this. That's exactly what I was going to say, is that I think the region, firstly, where we are at, to answer Asher's point, is that I don't see normalization being on the horizon now. I think it's difficult, never impossible, but difficult. But I see it as an opportunity now to start perhaps refocusing our focus on not normalization, but on peace. I think leading up to October 7th, peace and normalization has been so separated. I've never been so separated before. And I think that has to be kind of, there needs to be effort to focus more on the peace aspect. Now, the problem is that we have to address also Palestinian-Israeli fatigue. So in other words, many people, when they say the Palestinian-Israeli issue, people say, you know, not again, here we go again. And then we have a David versus Goliath. It turns into a very binary, polarized, superficial discussion. And it shouldn't be. And therefore, I think it has to be addressed into this issue on regional peace. And also, I don't think we are ready for more normalization on the political level, because there is just so much polarization taking place in the region. It is just not healthy. And the reason why I say that Saudi-Israeli normalization shouldn't be happening now against this backdrop, because I want it to work. Because if it happens now, in this current climate, it will never work. It will always be cold. And it will always be this whole peace, people to people. This will always be very, very difficult to obtain. No, I actually want it to work. And therefore, we have to do it right. We have to have the right kind of climate. We need to focus on more peace. We need to focus on more people-to-people interactions of peace against the backdrop within a framework of peace, not just normalization. And by the way, peace, Palestinian-Israeli regional peace, not a lot of the times it's, yeah, let's have peace between this country and that country. Of course, who's going to say no to peace? But really, there's a circumnavigation of a particular problem. So we need to address the current issue, Palestinian-Israeli issue, head on, and this will then open doors for many opportunities. Thank you all.
Thank you all, and I apologize for the very poor internet connection that I have now been experiencing. I think I got most of the information, your thoughts and ideas. And I would like to thank you all for participating and sharing with us these ideas. I mean, I've heard a lot of actually common denominators among you all. First, indeed, the importance of Saudi Arabia for the possibility of any future engagement between Israelis and Palestinians, but even more so thinking about it regionally to include other states in a regional setting that could lead to greater stability in the region and perhaps would lead to some constructive change with regards to Israelis and Palestinians. I heard a lot also about values, about humanity, and really the drastic need to think about values and perhaps the challenges of lack of values right now. We're in this moment. We are in a very, very delicate situation, very sensitive and really explosive. And I do hope that we can meet a month from now again and look back and see that actually some diplomacy managed to diffuse the tension. Diplomacy in Israel between Israelis and Palestinians over the future of Gaza, and diplomacy between Israelis and Hezbollah and Lebanese over diffusing the situation there and regulating some different kind of political arrangement between Israel and Lebanon. Who knows, perhaps even demarcating their shared boundary. Something to think about. So thank you all for your participation. Thank you for the people behind the scenes who have supported this webinar. And I wish you all the best. And we should give peace a chance, to conclude with a song. Thank you.